Okay, we stopped our last video looking at industrial sponsorship of academic research. This can be a definite conflict of interest. If an industry sponsors academic research, it usually does that because it wants to make money off of a product. And if the research doesn't support what would make money for a company, that can be a problem. There can be pressure on a researcher to produce something that the sponsorship will make the sponsor happy, and they will continue the sponsorship, and so money will continue to run in. If you find something that makes the product look bad in research, obviously that research isn't going to be sponsored by a company anymore. So here's an example. This actually happened to me when I was a information specialist, and I was working at a University of Missouri, and working with the research they were doing and publicizing that. And there was a university egg researcher who found that there was low cholesterol in eggs. Now think about this for a minute, and you might say to yourself, well, my understanding was that there was high cholesterol in eggs. Well, that's all of our understanding, except this researcher. And she said, contrary to every other study that's ever been done, actually eggs have low cholesterol. You should buy them and not worry. I was about to go and do that research. I thought, this is amazing. And one of my fellow professionals I worked with said, "Oh, you're going to that researcher?" He said. I said, "Yeah, there hasn't been much done on her," and he said, "Well, that's because some of us have not done something on her because we think that maybe this has a conflict of interest." He said, "The research was actually sponsored by the National Egg Council." Does that seem suspicious that the National Egg Council is sponsoring research which says the opposite of what everything else was saying? I did end up interviewing her, and I did something, but I didn't really emphasize that because I believed it probably was a conflict of interest, definitely a conflict of interest, and I don't know how that research came about. We're going to move now to a subject of publication and openness. And that is part of ethics, because when you publish things and you are open, people can check those and recheck them, and that's how you keep people honest, by having their research examined. At least that's how you keep researchers honest. So openness in science only began in the 17th century. Before that, researchers hid their information. So if somebody came up with research, they discovered something, they weren't going to tell everybody, because that would mean that it wasn't their secret anymore, it wasn't their information, and they would get no credit for it. So they would hide it so others would not exploit it. Now, there wasn't any way to patent. There still isn't any way to patent an idea. You can patent a process, but ideas have always had a difficulty having registering that idea. In fact, even Isaac Newton originally was careful with his information. He didn't publish it. He was afraid people would steal it. One time he spent something like had 20 years of research. There was a fire. It had never been published over 20 years, and all of that was lost. It's kind of heartbreaking when you think of how intelligent he was to have lost all that information. However, after this, a society was established that published ideas in a peer review system. That was where other researchers would read something and say, give their stamp of approval, their imprimatur on that research, and that's why we have articles today, and why we peer review things. So that was established. They had a society that did that, and in a way it was like patenting an idea. It wasn't patenting an idea, but you could get credit for being the first person to think of something because you had an article. And that's why we cite people today, because we want to show we know that somebody else did it, and that we're not plagiarizing, but also give credit to the person who came up with an original idea. So it became a way for researchers to be recognized for ideas. Even Einstein, he was first recognized when he had a miracle year and published 5 papers. So that was this whole idea of publication is really significant to human knowledge. Original thinkers still had to be cited, however, even with the publication, and that's is still why we do it today. That's why we emphasize citation so much. So not citing original thinkers still is a problem. Have I ever encountered this problem? I definitely have. I know somebody who was furious at another researcher because that researcher had said he was the first person to come up with something, and this other researcher had come up with the idea first, and he said, not only did I come up with the idea first, this other researcher knows it because he came to one of my conference presentations where I talked about it. Is that a problem? Well, there's nothing legal you can do about that, certainly, but um, that it certainly can still harm your reputation. Now, the sharing of research materials. Do you ever get to share research materials before it's published? Well, during the initial stage of research, researchers can keep their information private. They can keep it to themselves. You'll see people at a conference, a research conference. I'll say, "What are you doing?" They say, "Oh, I'm working on this great study on agenda setting." I'll say, "Well, what it's about?" I'm going to be. It'll probably come out for publication in a year, but they won't actually often tell you the details. They're afraid you might try to duplicate it and get it in first. So you're allowed to kind of hide the material during the first stage of the research. One time, when I made a conference presentation. I was a master's student. It was the first research presentation I had done. And I got a letter from a prominent researcher who said, that sounds really good. Could you send me a copy of your research? And my professor at the time said, don't send a copy. They will steal your idea. Now, in that particular case, I later found out that the guy is pretty nice. He probably wasn't trying to steal my information, but that does happen sometimes. So when research is published, there is still some expectation of sharing data. In communication circles, however, this has not been common. In communication circles, sometimes you can ask people for additional information, and they often will not share that. Even in journals, you don't often get the complete information. If you wanted to look at a database to see what research they got, to double check the numbers, that usually is not available in communication circles. In fact, only one communication journal, Public Opinion Quarterly, a very good communication journal, gives reviewers access to the original databases. So when you do a research report for Public Opinion Quarterly, you have to send the databases in so they can double check to make sure everything is honest and also has been done appropriately. Continuing on the sharing of research materials, most communication researchers don't share databases. Most don't want to do that, partly because maybe they're going to do more research. The other thing is, I believe that some people are afraid that another researcher will find that they've made some mistakes. It's not common among communication researchers. In other areas of research, it is, however. So some communication researchers will not share materials such as question instruments even. Usually people will. I was doing a research on how happy people were. It was how advertising copywriters, how happy they were with their job situation. It was workplace happiness. And there was one guy, his name was Pokrinsky, who lives in the Midwest someplace. He had done some research on that, so we asked him if we could use his instrument, and he said absolutely. He sent it to us, and he said if you'd like to cooperate on some research in the future, I'd be glad to work with you. A really nice guy. So we ended up using that question instrument. That was very nice. Some people will not do that. In fact, in psychology, it's quite common to require payment if somebody uses an instrument that you came up with. What does this say about science and communications? Some in communication will do that as well. I think there are some things that could improve in communication research. And sharing those things without a cost, just for honesty and transparency, is probably a good idea. We're going to look at allocation of credit next. We're going to talk about, who do you give credit to? Who ethically are you obligated to? Who do you have a responsibility to say, these people helped me? And we will look at that in our next video.